Okay, so we're on Samach Beis Amud Aleph, about 10 or so lines from the bottom. We're actually going to start a new sugya. We completed, I guess, 2 weeks ago now, the whole discussion about when interest actually starts. Does it start from the time of the discussion or from the time that it actually when you transact? So that machlokes was discussed it in about Adim. So we see that at the end of the day, the Gemara says Shema Mina, that even the discussion of making a deal before you make a deal really has ramifications for ribis. Now, again, the question is lahalacha. If you don't transact, you don't have ribis. But just the Gemara wanted to show the impact of ribis that certainly even a discussion is something that should not be on the table. But as a practical matter, that's not the halacha. All right. So now we're going to turn to something very interesting. Something that you wouldn't necessarily think has a connection. So Amar Rav Safra, this is about, again, 10 lines from the bottom. Amar Rav Safra, Kol she'ilu b'dineim motzian milove l'malve, b'dineinu machzirim l'malve l'love. Anything in the secular courts, right, the common law, the secular courts, or even at the time of the Gemara, where the courts would require the love to pay the malve interest. In our halacha, we return the interest from the malva to the love. So that's a very interesting statement, because here we're measuring ourselves against the goyim, and we're saying where the logic of a non-Jewish court is that a lova should pay interest, we say the actual opposite. We're going to get into that in a minute, what that actually means. And then the second part of Safra said, Kol she'ilu b'dineim ein motziin melova l'malve. Anything in the non-Jewish courts where the judges do not require the love to pay the malve, whatever that case is b'dineinu, in our halacha, ein machzirim malve l'love. So if the love paid the malve doesn't have to pay him back. Remember, if they say the love has to pay the malve, then we require the malve to pay the love back. But if they don't require the love to pay to the malve, in other words, there was no shiur, even though it might appear so, then we say that if he paid, ein machzirin, the malva does not have to repay the lova. So again, that seems a little cryptic, but we're going to get to it in a minute. But the point of it is that in order to understand our halacha, the Gemara is saying we have to understand the halacha of the non-Jewish courts. What do they say? Right? I mean, we don't go with what they say, but what do they say?
Rabbi, can I?
That's Rav Safra's introduction, and we'll delve into that in a minute.
Rabbi, can I get some context?
Can you speak a little louder, Michael? A little louder?
Can you hear me now? Is that
better?
better?
Yes.
Okay. Can you put some context in this? So we are supposed to abide by non-Jewish courts for where we live, where it doesn't contradict with halacha. If there are two Jews involved, then we would, during these times, we would go to Beis Din for this.
Right.
If it's the ribis does not hold against non-Jews, so presumably in a secular court, if there's a judgment between a Jew and a non-Jew, it would hold because the prohibition against ribis doesn't restrict us. So
yeah.
So what are the cases here? So is this a case where it would be two Jews appearing in a non-Jewish court and then coming to Beis Din, or what's the context?
Well, again, that's why Jews are always encouraged to go to Beis Din, because the rules in Beis Din, the halachas, apply to Jews, whereas in a non-Jewish court it doesn't. But to your point, if two Jews decided that they were going to go to court and not go to Bezdin, which means that the court has jurisdiction and the Bezdin cannot have jurisdiction, because once you go to court, you have to abide by the law of the court. So you can't you don't get a double dip.
Right.
So what would happen is that if you went to court and they made a decision which involves ribis, then basically you have violated the halacha, but your hands are tied, because what are you going to do? I mean, the court has issued, unless the parties themselves come to an agreement, the court has issued a rule which is keneged halacha. So again, that's one of the problems with dealing in secular courts, is that in many cases there isn't a problem. In many cases they do conform. But here we're going to see, and we're going to see specifically what the Gemara means, that what the problem is. So let's hold off a little bit. But your question is essentially, we start off with the premise that two Jews go to Bezdin. If they don't go to Bezdin and they go to the jurisdiction of a secular court, they're obviously controlled by that decision, and there could be an Issa Ribis. It could be an Issa Ribis which they will have no control over, because the court will have issued a judgment which is against halacha. So therein lies a problem.
Just one follow-up question, and if it's going to be addressed, that's fine.
Yeah.
So, but it isn't the position, at least in the time of the Gemara, that if someone were to, ribis is, as we learned, it's even to discuss it, while that's not the halacha, to even contemplate that.
Right, it's a very serious offense.
It's a very serious offense. So what's the Torah's position on a person taking this to a secular court when there's the prospect of ribis?
So there's, interestingly, there is no specific halacha which says that you have violated. That in other words, it's not a lo sase that where you have violated a principle in the Torah, but certainly from the Torah language and from the Gemara, in those days they certainly avoided going to secular courts. Today, maybe there's a little bit more of a two parties that are dealing with a complicated matter. They'll go to court. But again, if two Jews are involved, especially if they're Jewish, Orthodox, or Yerushalayim, they're not going to try to adjudicate in court, because you're then at the mercy of the decisions of the court, which could be contrary to halacha. So, it's incumbent on the litigants, just like we say, for instance, we avoid the interest question by having a star that halacha is acceptable, so that two Jewish parties can transact with a monetary gain, but it's not ribis. So we see that halacha is able to overcome some of the barriers that business people would have. So you know what? You don't have to go to court, because we have ways of dealing with the issue. But if two people decided we want to go to court, and they happen to be two Jewish people who would otherwise not violate this halacha, and the court says you've got to do it, you're really up against the wall. What are you going to do? You can't go to the judge and say, "Oh, by the way, my halacha, my law says you can't do this," because
Well, that's the final question. So I thought that we are not, as people, supposed to even contemplate ribis, to put ourselves in a position. So by agreeing to go to a secular court, that's always a prospect. So that's not an aveira to do that, for two Jews to agree, knowing or even not knowing that the consequences could be that ribis is paid, which is contrary to Torah law.
Right. So I think when the Gemara is going to give us later on, just a short while, the examples of Rav Safra's case, it'll become clear, I think, Michael, what the issue is. So let's hold off on that. In the meantime, what the Gemara now wants to do is they want to ask a kasha on Rav Safra. How can Rav Safra say this? We see from another source that this isn't correct. So the Gemara sort of digresses for a minute and wants to ask a kasha or two on Rav Safra's position, and then we'll explain Rav Safra a little bit more. So what does the Gemara say? The Gemara says, Omalei Abaye Rabbi Yosef. Abaye says to Rabbi Yosef, Uchlalohu, is Rav Safra's ruling, is that universal? Is that klal? Is that a klal? Bahare saw b'saw. In the case of the saw b'saw, what is saw b'saw? Saw means that I gave you or lent you a saw. A saw is a measure. Let's call it a bushel. If I lent you a bushel of wheat, you have to pay me back a bushel of wheat, right? So that's clear. So according to the non-Jewish court, if it comes back and the borrower says, I'm not paying you, then the court would say, what do you mean you're not paying? You borrowed a saw, you have to pay back a saw, right? So in that particular case, the courts are very clear. You got to pay back. So what should be the halacha according to Rav Safra? According to Rav Safra, that if he paid him, then the malva should give it back to the lover. But according to our halacha, that's not the case. In other words, saw b'saw, and again, he says saw b'saw because that's a specific thing where, again, you're trading in a commodity regardless of the price. So the whole question of the price lies beneath this issue because you're giving them back a saw. But let's say the saw is now worth, instead of being worth $1, worth $1.25. So ubedinenu in our halacha ein machzirin malva lelova. If the lover gave him back the saw, then the malva doesn't have to give it back to him, even though it appears to be ribis, because it has inflated in value. So how can Rav Safra make this general rule that when the general courts require the lover, you borrowed, you have to pay back. There's no question. So then, l'chayra from our Rav Safra halacha, the flip side should be true, is that if you paid him, the malva has to give it back. Here we see the malva doesn't give it back, right? Malva doesn't give it back. So he's asking a kasha on Rav Safra. How can Rav Safra say this is the rule? We see an example by Saul Basar that he doesn't have to pay him back. So what's the pshat? Amalei. So Rabbi Yosef said back to Abaye. What did he say to him? Inu b'taris pikadon osali adeh. In other words, there's a nuance to this. According to our understanding, Saw B'Saw, this is a novel. Saw B'Saw isn't a loan. In other words, you can't compare it to Rav Safra because Rav Safra is talking about loans. Saw B'Saw, he says, is a pikadon. In other words, I gave you a saw for a pikadon. A pikadon means like a deposit, or you're holding it for me, and then you give it back to me. So it's a nuanced term, but it's not considered a loan. So according to the Gemara, this case where the malveh does not have to return to loveh, you can't ask a kasha on Rav Safra because we're not talking about ribbis. We're not talking about interest. We're talking about a pikadon. I give you a pikadon. You have to give me back the pikadon. Doesn't matter what it's worth. Just give me back my saw. Give me back my bushel of grain. Doesn't matter what the cost is.
So Rabbi, this is a distinction between a shomer chinam, a custodian, versus an actual loan.
Mike, I'm sorry, but I'm not hearing you well. I don't know if it's me or you.
Can you hear me
better.
now? Better?
Yeah.
So this is the distinction between being a custodian, a shomer chinam, versus lending.
Right.
Actually, literally lending.
Lending. So he's saying that in the case of a saw b'saw, it's not a loan. You can't classify that as a loan. In other words, just as a metzias, giving a saw b'saw is not a loan. If it's not a loan, then the whole question of interest doesn't apply. So there's no kasha on Rav Safra, even though then we're saying the malva doesn't have to return it to the lover if the lover paid him. What do you mean he paid him? He gave him back the saw, but it appears to be interest because the saw is now worth $1.25. Says the Gemara, don't worry about it because this is a pikadon, not a loan, so it's not in the same parsha, it's not in the same plane, and therefore we don't have to worry about it. So we ask a kasha on Rav Safra. There's no kasha on Rav Safra.
So does the distinction need to be made at the time of the exchange that this is not a loan, but it's a custodial situation?
The Gemara is saying it's understood. We don't even have to articulate it. It's understood that when you're dealing with a commodity, not money. In other words, I don't loan you $100 and then get 110 back. I give you a saw. That giving is not a loan, it's a pikadon. In other words, that's the established understanding that we're now dealing with a pikadon. Then it's no kasha and Rav Safra. Right. So that's one. The Gemara tries to slug up Rav Safra, and it doesn't work. Now the Gemara is going to try again. Another situation which seems to be contrary to Rav Safra. Amalei Ravina Ravashi. So Ravina said to Ravashi, "V'hare mashkanta below nechaisa." In other words, the situation is this: I borrow $100 from you. In return, I have a mashkin. I have a. How do you secure the loan? I have a vineyard. I'm going to pledge the vineyard to you. You have the vineyard, which is worth $100, maybe more, and this way you'll feel comfortable in lending me the money. Now, what is the din? The din is that while you're holding my vineyard as a mashkin, what happens if the grapes become ripe? Can you take from the grapes? You're allowed to eat the grapes, or do you just have to let them lie there? So the din is, you can eat from the grapes, but when it comes to valuing the return, you have to count those grapes that you ate as part of the deal. Okay? So again, I borrow money. I give you a pledge of a mashkin, a pledge of a vineyard. It could be anything, but if it's a piece of ground that produces something, and you're allowed to eat it, then if I had to repay you the whole 100, then it would be pure interest because you're taking something of value over and above the deal, because I borrowed $100, and if I pay you $100 back and we don't deduct the amount of what he consumed, that would be ribis. So the Gemara says that v'hare mashkanta b'lo nechaisa, that if there was a pledge of a property and you did not reduce the amount of that you ate, so according to the general courts, the lover has to repay to the malva, right? I mean, he borrowed $100, he has to give him $100. The one holding the pledge ate the grapes. The halacha, the Gentile courts aren't going to say, oh, you now have to deduct the amount of the consumed grapes. They're not going to say that. They're going to say that the lover borrowed 100, he has to repay 100, right? That's what they're going to say. Now, what are we going to say? We're going to say, according to our halacha, if he paid him the $100, even though he consumed the grapes, we don't deduct. In other words, you shouldn't do it. But if you do it, says the halacha, we're not going to go back to the malva and say, you malva have to now deduct the amount of the grapes that you consumed, and you have to repay it to the lover. So
wouldn't it be obvious, Rabbi? Wouldn't it be obvious that if you have a big vineyard worth, $100 to eat, just to taste a couple of grapes, would not be considered a big issue? It's part of if somebody says, I'll let you my car, all right, and you take the car out for 2 miles and you use half a gallon of gas, you're not going to consider that to be ribis.
Yeah, You're correct, but we're not talking about such a situation. We're talking about a situation where he lent them the money, he's holding it for months, and he keeps eating the grapes or pressing it. In other words, it's not just a minimal amount. You're right. For a minimal amount, we might not, we might overlook it as just as a kind of a throwaway. But ribbis is ribbis. Ribbis is ribbis, and I don't think that there is a shiur necessarily of a minimum or a maximum. But let's say you're right. Let's say that we're not talking about a half a gallon of gas. We're talking about a whole tank, $25, $30 worth. Doesn't that look like ribbis? Because he's taking it and using it.
Isn't it implied that when you use something as a mashkin that
no, a mashkin should be static.
I mean, as collateral. I mean, this is collateral so that he knows we'll get the money back.
Right, but collateral doesn't mean that you can now invade the property, and it's collateral. You hold it. When you get the money back, you give it back to me. Where does it say that you have the rights to the property, that you can harvest it?
It depends on what it's all about assumptions.
Yeah. And Rabbi,
when people do business, or they lend money back and forth, there's a certain number of assumptions that are not discussed always. They're not written down. But it's the way you do things.
So to your point, Jay, the secular courts are not going to factor that into the deal. They're not going to say, "Oh, the Malva ate $20 worth of grapes. You have to pay him $80." They're going to go back to the Lova and say, "Pay the $100 because you borrowed $100." So in other words, the Gentile courts are not going to factor in the consumption as part of the deal. But
Rabbi,
according to Rav Safra, we should.
Rabbi, this is not a loan. You said before, if we consider this as a custodial situation, his obligation is to return what he has been entrusted, the property he's been trusted with. It doesn't say when you're a shomer chinam, you can use the item and you can return it as is. It doesn't say. So this is why the distinction between whether it's a loan or a custodial situation matter.
So it's an interesting point, but let me just point out to you, if you go back and look, in the first case, we distinguish from Rav Safra by saying it's a Torah's pikodon. A pikodon, it's in the verb. A pikodon is different than a mashkin. A pikodon is different than a mashkin. A pikodon means that it's not really a pledge. A pikodon is an assurance, a deposit. In other words, hold on to this until I pay you back, and this will be your assurance that I pay you back. Okay,
so it's collateral.
That's how I think you have to look at a pikodon. So
it's collateral, but that doesn't say that you can't use the collateral unless it's stipulated. To Jay's point, the specification, if it's not specified, the presumption is that he can use it, which i.e. means he can eat the grapes since it's collateral. But
like a lawnmower,
right? So
I'll give you the lawnmower as security that I'm going to pay you back.
But if you specify that you can't eat the grapes, you got to save them and give them back to me, or you're going to deduct it. That should be in the agreement. I mean, this is, as you said before, it's the presumption of what is the base case if nothing stated.
Right. So in most cases, you would say the parties would articulate all the details of the deal. Let's say they didn't. Okay, you're right. But let's say they didn't. So now we have a blank page. What's the halacha? We don't have negotiated details. It's a blank page. So the Gemara says that in the first case, where I give you a pikodon to hold on to so that you're sure that I pay you back, says the Gemara, a pikodon is different than a loan. Therefore, in a pikodon, by sol b'sol, which is a pikodon, he says, remember, it's sol b'sol. It's a different situation. It's a commodity exchange for a return for another commodity. So in that particular case, the Gemara says that is different than a loan, so you can't compare it to Rav Safra. The second case that we're talking about is not so much a picodon, but he uses the term mashkanta. Mashkanta is different. What is a mashkanta? A mashkanta is I give you something, and typically, whereas a deposit you would hold on to, a mashkanta is something that you're allowed to use. I give you a mashkin, and that mashkin is something that inherently is something you can use, right? You can use it. So it's different than a picodon. So then the Gemara says, when we see in this case of mashkanta, that the secular courts would make the love pay the full amount to the malva, even though the malva took off and ate part of the mashkin. And so that what should be the halacha? The halacha is that the malva should pay him back. According to Rav Safra, it's the reverse. Malva should pay him back. And in B'dinenu ain't machzir malva lelova. And according to our halacha, we don't say the malva has to pay back the lova. So again, it seems to be a kasha on Rav Safra because his rule doesn't apply. Now, I know, Michael, you're troubled by this.
I'm very troubled.
The question is, if the parties articulate what exactly you're allowed to do, and the lova says to the malva as part of the deal, I owe you $100. There is fruit on the vine. Let's make a deal. You can eat some of that food and you'll pay me for it. What do you mean you'll pay me for it? That will deduct the amount of the loan, let's just say. So if they spoke it out and said it, it's quite different. But where we don't have any specific agreement, and now we step back and say, wait a minute, he borrowed $100, he's going to pay him back $100, but now it's going to cost him $120 because the lender ate $20 worth of grapes. So,
but Rabbi,
with this,
but
again,
Rabbi,
it's not agreed upon, Michael. It's not agreed upon. It's prima facie. What's the deal?
Well, so the deal is, so when let's say the case is where he gave the vineyard as collateral during not the growing season, and the loan remained outstanding, and the grapes, and so he held on to the money longer than he would have, and it comes to a growing season, and it goes through harvest. And I don't know what the requirement of the owner as whether he has to, he has to give Truma and Maser off of that since it's a collateral. But it happens that it evolves during the period where he's held it. So he could have preempted that because this is merely collateral. There's no exchange unless the loan doesn't get paid back. So the point is at that point, it's still going through. The Lovek can say, I'm going to pay you back because I want that fruit. But in the meantime, the fruit's going to go to waste. So why should the Malva not take advantage? I mean, the Lova, who's the collateral?
The
Malva not take advantage of eating the grapes because it's collateralized. I mean, there's nothing specified in what you're saying. So that's on him. He could have paid the loan back earlier. Why is it ribis? Because it went through a long season, and that's what happens. He's giving back what he used as collateral at the same point as when he got it. By the time the grapes are harvested and he returns the vineyard.
Right. But I think what the Gemara is saying is we're painting a picture of what should be ribis. And the picture looks like this. I borrow $100 from you. I have a vineyard, orchard, whatever, I have a vineyard. And I'm giving you that vineyard as a mashkin. Now, mashkin, again, a little bit different than a picodon. Let's say I give it to you as a mashkin. And just looking at it from the outside looking in, we say that the malva shouldn't touch any of the fruit. That fruit belongs to the lovet. The lovet should be the one who should be gathering the fruit even during the season because it's his field. So now the lovet is not gathering it. The malva is taking it, and the malva is consuming it. Now we're just looking at this picture and we're saying, wait a minute. The Malve, the Malva lent $100. He's going to get his $100 back. In the meantime, and again, it wasn't anything unusual. It was supposed to be for 60 days. So during that 60 days, there's grapes that are growing in the vineyard. So if I'm looking at the picture, I'm saying, wait a minute, those grapes belong to the Lovet. There's no question in my mind because he's still the owner. And like you said, he's the one chayav and truma and masa and whatever it is, the Lovet, not the Malvet. So if the Lovet is mechuyev, then it all belongs to the Lovet. The Malvet now is consuming something that belongs to the Lovet. He's getting a benefit. I'm just looking at this picture and I say, wait a minute, the Malvet is now getting, let's say, $20 worth of grapes without anything attached, and he's still going to get his $100. That to me looks like ribbis because the Lova owns it. The Lova should be the one going into the field and picking it and taking it. Why should the Malva take it? But again, we're going to see from the teretz, the answer is better than the kasha. But your point is that what you're saying is that the Malva shouldn't be chayiv in ribbis because it's kind of incidental to what he has when he's
well, he knew. So you said the loan was over 60 days. I thought the loan was unlimited, but let's say it's over 60 days. He knows the fruit's going to turn. That was his option to present that as collateral. He could have definitely withdrawn. He could have given something else if he knew that there would be additional value.
But I think the Gemara's assumption is that the fact that I give you something as a pledge doesn't mean it's yours. It's still mine. If it's mine, those grapes belong to me, and I should be the one taking them, or the Malva should be saying to the lover, you can get your grapes because your grapes belong to you.
Isn't it a matter of what the Torah defines collateral as? So if the grapes belong to the Lova, then the Lova should get the grapes, if that's what collateralization is. But if you're a shomer chinam, you can use that. Can you not use the property until he takes it back? So you know, as long as you bring it back in the condition that it was, so then why can't he eat the grapes? Because he's holding it. It's not ribbis.
But aren't we mixing two ideas?
Yeah, the analogy of a shomer chinam really doesn't apply because a shomer chinam is strictly voluntary. I ask you to do me a favor, you do me a favor. Here we're talking about a transaction. This isn't a favor. It's a transaction. It's a monetary transaction. And in the course of a monetary transaction, the field produces something. And the question is, what do we do with that produce?
So what is
the Torah is saying?
So we're not
the Malvesh shouldn't be taking that food because by taking that food, he is falling into the category of ribbis because he's getting a bigger benefit from the loan than he should, and that's what ribbis is. Ribbis is getting a benefit from the loan.
Michael is asking the question about 20 minutes ago. Isn't this like a shomer chinam? And I guess it turns out the answer is this has nothing to do with the shomer.
That's correct. It has nothing to do with the shomer.
So, but the question is, what inherently is collateral? If it's supposed to be, you're not supposed to benefit from that at all, then it's clear that he has to return the grapes. The Malva has to return,
and that's what the Havamin of the Gemara is. That there is nothing here that should allow the Malva to benefit from the field because al pi halacha it belongs to the Lovet. So the Lovet, even though it's in sort of control, if you will, of the Malva because of the Mashkin, the field doesn't go into his back pocket. The field is the field. It's sitting there in the middle of everything. And it could be that the Lova owns fields all around it. This is one field. So the Malva isn't taking the field for his own. So he's just saying, I have rights to the field.
So isn't the Lova entitled to go, since it's collateralized, and pick his grapes during the period that it's collateralized? So why is this even an issue? Because what we're saying, and it's vastly different than a shomer chinam, which I didn't understand from the prior discussion. So that's why I was trying to understand what it is. But it's basically saying you hold it, and the only time you're going to possess anything is if I don't pay. So as long as the loan is in force and it has not elapsed, then it's the owner's property, and the owner should be able to go in and do whatever they want during this period. So I don't know what there's a big machlokas about.
Well, so again, the terrorist is going to be better than the kasha, but the kasha is you, Rav Safra, say that where the Gentile courts require the lover to pay back the malva, no question about it. Then we, the Bezdin, the religious courts, say that the malva, if he gets paid, has to return it, which means that he should deduct the portion of the grapes that he ate from the amount of the loan, because there was no deal that said that the malva can eat the grapes. There was no deal that said, malva, when it's in your possession, you can eat the grapes. By taking the grapes and still getting the full amount of the loan, he's showing that that is ribis. He's showing that that is something that is improper. So,
but if he says, I don't want the grapes.
No, if he doesn't want the grapes and doesn't take them, that's no problem.
Yeah, but in a collateralized position, so the answer is under halacha, he can't take the grapes. So
Correct.
He's still returning.
The lover should take the grapes. Under the halacha,
so the lover can
should
take the grapes. So that's the only question. And if he under halacha, if he takes the grapes, but that I don't understand why that isn't either implicit in the deal one way or the other, and then if it's going to be contrary, the agreement should specify that. And it sounds like implicit in halachic law, when the agreement is structured, is that he's not entitled to the grapes, so that's the answer. And if he takes them, then he has to deduct it.
But that halacha says that if he paid him back, if the malva ate the grapes, the lover paid back the whole $100, and the malva can walk away and doesn't have to repay. But according to Rav Safra, the malva should give him back $20 because he ate $20 worth of grapes. That's the kasha.
But the halacha isn't like Rav Safra.
Wait a minute. We don't know anything right now, Michael. Let's not jump ahead. We're saying that Rav Safra made a pronouncement, and that pronouncement is something that now the Gemara is going to say, Zeh Klau? Is this really the rule of Safra? We see exceptions to the rule. We don't know who the halacha is like. Again, the Gemara is now going through a sort of a shaklamataria. Here's Rav Safra. Rav Safra was a big gadol, and he made this following pronouncement. Okay, everybody has to abide by it. So the Gemara asks the kasha, what do you mean, Rav Safra? We see a case where saw b'saw. No, saw b'saw is something different. It's a pikadon. Then the Gemara says, but wait a minute, what about a mashkin? If you gave him a mashkin and he went ahead and ate part of the mashkin, then l'chayra, you should deduct that $20 of grapes. But we don't say that. We say that ubedinenu ein machzirim in malva l'lover. The malva does not have to repay after he gets paid his $100. He does not have to deduct $20 worth of grapes, and he can walk away. And to you and I as bystanders, that's ribis. How can you do that?
But it's not. But obviously, halachically, it's not, because the Torah would forbid us from doing that.
Okay, so all right.
All right, I'll wait to see what evolves.
Again, I'm telling you that the tariff is more significant than the kasha, but that's the kasha. The kasha is on. Remember, there was no details negotiated, Michael. This wasn't a detail. This was simply a contract. I need $100. You lend me $100. I'll give you my vineyard as a mashkin. Hold on to it. No discussion, no detail. Who eats the grapes? When eat the grapes? Nothing like that at all. And then now what developed over that period of time is that it did grow grapes. So the question is, who does that belong to? So l'chayra, we would say it should belong to the lover, because the malva doesn't own the property. It's a mashkin. So the lover should be able to eat the grapes. But the lover went to Eretz Yisrael, and the grapes are sitting there, and the malva says, wait a minute, these are grapes. They're fine looking grapes. I'm going to have some of these grapes. Okay, it wasn't written to any star that he should or shouldn't. So the malva is going to have the grapes. Fine. The malva comes back from Eretz Yisrael. He says, I have your money. Wait a minute. You ate $20 worth of grapes while it was gone. Let's deduct that from the price. So that the Gentile courts, the general court would say nothing doing. You've got to pay. You borrowed 100. You got to pay him 100. We're not looking at the grapes. But b'dinenu, in our halacha, according to Rav Safra, the malva should repay the lover $20 because he consumed $20 worth of grapes, and if he doesn't pay him, it looks like ribbis. So the Gemara's kasha is, how could you, Rav Safra, say as a general rule that when the non-Jewish courts say you have to pay, the halacha is you have to return. You're seeing here the general courts say you have to pay the $100, and we say ein machzir malva, that the malva does not have to repay him the $20 worth of grapes. How does that fit into Rav Safra's condition? So let's just go to the teretz, and then you'll see there's another nuance here. So what did we say before? In the first case, we said it was a pikad and it wasn't a loan. So Amalei, so now Ravina says back to him, Eina b'teres zivine osaliyadei. So we're going to introduce something different here. That according to the terms of this agreement, it's not a loan, but it is as if it's a purchase. That's how you have to interpret it. It came into his hands as vina means a purchase. It came into his hand as a purchase. So if it came into his hand as a purchase, now we understand. The Malva bought the property. During the period of time that he owns the property, he's eating the grapes. It no longer belongs to the lover. It belongs to the Malva. He can eat the grapes. Now, when the lover comes back, he's going to repurchase the property for $100. So he buys the property back for $100, and the $20 of grapes that were eaten has nothing to do. He can't have a taina, I want it back. It was never his. He sold it. So the Gemara is now saying that in this particular case, it's not a kasha on Rav Safra, because a mashkin, again, in the interpretation of a mashkin, it's not a loan, it's a purchase. That's how they say we're looking at mashkin. If it's a purchase, it's a whole different deal. I know you don't like that, Michael, but the fact of the matter is that that's how they're saying that the non-Jewish courts don't understand this thing, mashkin. What's a mashkin? You're selling him a piece of ground, and in that ground there's grapes. Now, when you want to come to redeem the ground, we're going to allow you to redeem the ground, but whatever happened during that period of time. It belonged to the malveh. He can eat it. We thought it always belonged to the loveh because it was a loan, so therefore the malveh never had a rishus to take it. And when he took it, then it looks like ribbis. Says the Gemara, no, it's not a loan. Therefore, you can't classify it as a loan with ribbis. It's a purchase. When I buy something from you, it's mine. I can do what I want with it. I can consume it. I can do whatever I want to do. Now I'm allowing you the opportunity to buy it back. That's a new deal. I'm selling it back to you for $100. So fine. Now you have to pay me the $100, and I'll give you back the land. Or I'll give you.
Rabbi, this agreement is a sale and repurchase as of a specific.
Correct. A sale and repurchase, not a loan.
That's very different, but it's specified in the agreement that it's a sale and repurchase. Are you saying that de facto it is?
What he's saying is that a mashkin is understood to be a purchase. In other words, in those days when I came to you and I said, could you lend me $100? Here's a mashkin. That by definition, he's saying, is a purchase. It doesn't say it in the agreement, but so we understood it to be a sale.
So it's not a collateral. It is it's a sale and repurchase.
Correct.
And
correct. And that's how he avoids the kasha on Rav Safra, because if you're right, in the case of a loan, then the malva would have to deduct the $20 because it would be interest.
Yes.
Right? But we're not talking about a loan. We're talking about a sale. In a sale,
it's a required repurchase as of a specific date is implicit
right
in this agreement.
I guess the buzzword for mashkanta, is a sale, not a loan. In other words,
sale and repurchase, not a loan. That's a very different transaction.
And so that's what I'm saying. The teretz, in a way, is stronger than the kasha, because the teretz is saying, wait a minute, it's not a kasha in Rav Safra. Rav Safra is talking about a loan. We're talking about a purchase. Different animal.
That doesn't sound the way people operate. You don't assume it's a purchase. I mean,
Right.
you're saying maybe they did it that way in that time, but that doesn't make any sense because it's when you open up the door to purchases, you have a whole different world of purchasing. And this is not the situation. Somebody
And that's
borrowed
the thing.
$100 is
Yeah.
supposed to get
No, no.
$100 back.
Right. But Jay, he's saying that when two people enter into a deal and I'm borrowing $100 from you, and I say to you, here's a mashkin. Here's a mashkin for the $100. Then it's understood that that mashkin means a purchase. That's what the Gemara is saying.
But then it's
I don't
not
want that
collateral.
field
It's
as
not collateral.
It's not a
Correct.
purchase.
It's not collateral.
I would never buy that field
And
as a purchase.
not only that, but he can damage the collateral. In this case,
Right.
he could damage the vineyard.
He could do,
during
you're right.
his
He can do
ownership.
anything he wants to that land.
Right,
It's
but
his
then
land.
it's not the same value when he sells it back.
So again, so he didn't set fire to it. All he did is ate the grapes. The
Right, that
underlying
wouldn't be
value
damage.
of the ground is still $100, even though he ate the grapes.
Right.
So if you consider it to be a loan and he took $20 of value, that's ribis.
All right, but there's another problem. If he's got a $10,000, big, acres of land. The loan's $1,000. So if it's a loan and you say this is collateral for it, fine. It means that if the whole thing falls through, now you've got to sell part of the land to pay for it or whatever if you don't have the money to pay back. Fine. But if it's a sale of the land, now you have a problem. You're not going to sell $10,000 worth of land for $1,000 of a loan. You're going to go in place of being a loan.
No.
You're going to now have to subdivide and this and that, figure out
Okay,
exactly how much is going to match the loan.
Right. So Menashe, you're again, I understand what you're saying, but let's put it into context. Let's say it wasn't a disparity of the value to the loan. Let's say the loan was really in line with the value of the land. An acre worth of land, maybe.
Right. I'm saying it has to be roughly in line, or else it's just falls apart.
Roughly in line. Correct. So let's assume they're roughly in line. That in those days, $100, which is a lot of money, would be the equivalent of an acre of land. So the Malva says, I'll do that deal. Here's $100. I'll take the land. Now, so then we're back to square one. Rav Safra's rule is you can't touch that land. It belongs to the Lovet, and you Malva are eating produce that turns into ribis. But the Gemara is saying, no, when two people enter into a deal and I tell you, I'm giving you a mashkin for the $100, that buzzword, that mashkin means I just bought a piece of land and that land is now mine. Now, I'm going to give you an option to buy it back. I'm a good guy and I'm going to say, I'm going to give you an option to buy it back. But during the period that I own it, it's mine. Forget about the fact that
it sounds like a chametz deal.
Whatever. We're not talking about damaging the land. We're just talking about harvesting some grapes.
But it sounds like Pesach. You sell it to a guy and it's all chametz, and you may lose it all.
So that's a good point. What happens if you didn't sell it to the guy? You lent it to the guy. You said to the guy, "It's yours, and it's yours as a loan." Okay, and then you'll repay the loan. So again, first of all, that wouldn't work on Pesach because it's still yours. So that's a problem. But in that context, that's the difference between a loan and a sale. In a loan, I still own it, right? I still own it. Therefore, it's chametz b'Pesach. But in a loan, I own it. Therefore, I should be the balabos. I should be the balabos of the land. But in a purchase, if I'm selling it to you, you're the balabos of the land. Therefore, whatever you do to the land, consuming the grapes, whatever, can't be viewed as ribis because it's not a loan; it's a purchase. So that's how the Gemara wants to say.
So what happens if the liquor changes value? I mean, I think it sounds to me like a parallel story.
Yeah, but you're right. So Jay, in that case where you sold it and the liquor increased in value, then there's no ribis. There's no, first of all, he's a goy. Okay, so but let's say that aside, there would be no Indian of ribis because it's a purchase. You're right. I bought it for I transacted to the goy, and he is going to sell it back to me. And in a sale, it doesn't matter what the relative values are because the principle of ribbis doesn't apply. If all of a sudden in the 8 days it rose in value double.
But implicit in that agreement, even though in the chametz situation, the purchaser has the right to that chametz, owns that chametz during that time, there's got to be something in the agreement that specifies he will return it intact as the way it was.
But there isn't in that shtar mechira. There's no sort of trigger. It has to be understood that he will buy it back. But if you make it as a condition, then the question is it really a sale? I mean, that's a different issue on Pesach.
It's not a sale.
But it is. We're selling chametz. It is a sale.
No, in that situation, if you put in a condition that you'll have to, buy it back, I really don't want it. 100 houses full of liquor. It's just that's totally a sale, but it's an artificial sale.
But
because we know the outcome is sort of planned.
But to your point, Jay, this is the same thing, and that means
that's why I raised it, because this story that we're learning here in the Gemara has the same things. It sounds like the chametz with Pesach.
But it's understood that way. However, if the buyer, a temporary buyer, decides they want to do whatever they can do, it's, as Rabbi said, it is implicit that nothing's going to happen. But if something did happen during their period of ownership, there's nothing that could mitigate that because they own it at that point in time.
Right.
Same thing with the chametz. So, to Jay's point earlier, I wouldn't want a deal like that. Why couldn't there be just a collateral agreement?
So again, the Gemara's interpretation is that the very term mashkin doesn't mean a loan. I think that's where we have to focus on that. The term mashkin is a pledge, which the Gemara says by definition is not a loan. So there's no ribis issue. It's a sale rather than a loan, and therefore in a sale it doesn't matter what the malveh is doing because it's his. He bought it. Now there may be some rights triggered so that the quote loveh, who is the seller, can buy it back, and it's an I'll agree, okay, 60 days, 90 days, whatever it happens to be. And then he comes back and says, "Here's the $100," and he said, "Fine. Now you have your
but it's a sale.
I'll resell it to
purchase.
you." So whatever happened during that period of time is irrelevant to the question of ribis or to the question of I can do what I want with that land.
Well, that's why I made the point about you could ruin it. I mean, it's a sale.
You could ruin it
to repurchase.
No. You're right. He could ruin it, and then there would be other issues, right? If he's
right. So if I'm risking property that I don't want to be devalued, why would I do that? I mean, I have to give something equivalent, approximately equivalent, but why would I want that risk of someone who's not, let's say they're not a maven in cultivating a vineyard? Why would I want that risk in ruining that?
He wants to build a hotel,
right? Like and he can do it
in North Korea. I mean, this.
So if the lover came to the Malvin and he said, "I want to borrow $100," and says, "This land," and again, it's not the magic word. He doesn't say it's a mashkin. He says, "This land, you'll hold on to this land until I repay you." So there's no hint of a pledge or deposit or anything like that. So in a neutral world, that would be the classic case of ribis, because the malva then ate a portion of the produce without permission, because there was no stipulation. Let's just say there was no stipulation. He ate it, and then later, when it comes to repaying, so the Gentile courts would say you got to repay the $100, and the chayra, the Bezdin would say, malva, you got to give him back $20 because it's ribis. That's in the classic case of a loan.
why couldn't I say this land, I'm giving you this land as collateral, and I'm giving you a gift to eat the grapes that ripen during this time period as a harvest. It's not ribis, it's a gift, and you
It's
can eat
finished, so there's
whatever you
not a
want.
problem
Yeah,
here.
except that this is the problem, that in the context of a loan, a gift appears to be ribbis. That is the problem.
So it's all Morris-ian.
Yeah, yeah.
Why would the gift
It's a Maris Ayin that I'm giving you something to induce you. And again, the Gemara is going to talk about specific situations where I give you a gift in order for you to make a loan. Is that permissible or not? The Gemara is going to address that. But to your point, the Gemara is saying that the terms are important. Bikadin is one thing, a mashkin is something else. And once we are in the realm of a mashkin, then by definition, that's not a loan, that's a purchase. So again, you have to accept that in the Gemara's terminology, they make that distinction, and therefore there's no kasha on Rav Safra, because Rav Safra is talking strictly about loans, and then the Indian of ribis, everybody agrees. Everybody agrees. The non-Jewish courts say you got to pay. The Jewish courts say you have to give it back. So Rav Safra's halacha is intact because these exceptions have nothing to do with ribis. They have to do with, in this case, a sale. All right. So those are the two kashas on Rav Safra, and the Gemara sort of rebuts the two kashas by saying that in each case, if we call them a mashkin, they are not loans, and therefore it's no kasha. So now the Gemara, I said at the very beginning, the Gemara sort of takes a side route to ask these questions. Now the Gemara is coming back and saying, what is Rav Safra really saying? What's the basis of Rav Safra's rule that a Gentile court says one thing and a Bezdin says something else? How do we understand it? So now the Gemara says, Hachi also lashmeinim. This is the way we have to understand Rav Safra. Kol she'ilu b'dinei motzien milay ve'ermalver. So there's two parts to this, right? There's the first part, and then there's the second part. So any situation where, according to the Gentile courts, they require the lover to pay the malver, then according to halacha, according to the Bezdin, if he paid him, then the malver has to return it. My nihu, what's an example of that? Okay, we understand that's Rav Safra's position. My nihu. So the Gemara says that's exactly the case of beribis kitsutza could Rabbi Eliezer. That ribis kitsutza, which we said before, is also medivrei Torah, right? Ribis kitsutza means the very clear case of I lend you, Michael, 100. And then you're paying me, and you're going to be paying me back 110. That's ribis ketzutza. There is no question about it. Now, ribis ketzutza, according to Rabbi Lezer, why according to Rabbi Lezer? Because Rabbi Lezer says that can be repaid, that you can go to court and repay that. So the non-Jewish court will enforce it, and the Bezdin will say you have to give it back. Because it's ribis ketzutza, it's also midaraisa, right? So that's the first case. Again, we're trying to understand Rav Safra's reasoning, why he made this sort of statement, which looks a little cryptic, but what does it mean? So he says, when the non-Jewish court says prima facie case, you borrowed 100, you got to pay 100. You got to pay 100. I'm sorry, you borrowed 100, you made a deal to pay 110, you got to pay 110. The Gentile court doesn't know from ribis. So if the deal on paper says, I'm going to give you $110, that's what the court say you're entitled, the malva is entitled to collect. But if that's the case, and the court say you're entitled to collect it, then the halacha says you got to give it back. Why? Because the only way the Bezdin can make that pronouncement is in a case of ribis ketzutza, meaning a bona fide prima facie case where I lent you 100 and the shtar says you got to pay 110. That the court says, no question, you got to pay it. That's ribis ketzutza. Al pi halacha, ribis ketzutza is also midaraisa. Therefore, the Malva has to give him back the $10. And according to Rabbi Lezer, you can collect the $10. That's the first part of Rav Safra. Now, Kol She'ilu B'dinayim Ein Motziim B'dinayim in the case where the Gentile courts will not require the payment from the Lova of the Malva, then B'dineinu Ein Machzirin, then in our case, you don't have to return it. What is that about? Says the Gemara. That's referring to Ribis Mukdemes or Ribis Mu'ucheres. What does that mean? Ribis Mukdemes means there, and this goes to your question, Mike. What happens if he gives him a gift, right? How do we look at a gift? So Ribis Mukdemes means that I give you something before the loan to induce you to make the loan, or Ribis Mu'ucheres, we make the loan and I send you a thank you gift. So those are the two examples where the Gemara says that the non-Jewish court can't require him to make that payment because it's a voluntary thing. I'm giving you a gift. In the non-Jewish courts, a gift isn't equivalent to a mandatory payment. Says the halacha. If that's the case, then we're not going to require the Malva to pay it back because it's a gift. And in other words, what we're doing is we're separating the gift from the loan. And by separating the gift from the loan, to your point, it's two separate inyan. It's two separate matters. The loan is the loan, and the gift is the gift. So the Gemara elucidates for us what is an example of where the halacha is not going to require you to pay. Now, you might argue, but wait a minute, doesn't that smack of something that he gave him a gift and then he went for a loan? So the Gemara wants to just separate and say that what you do in life, you do in life. I like you, I want to give you a gift, or in the future I'm going to make a loan, and in order to do that, I'll open up a bank account, I'll put money in. In other words, you do things that would make you more, the potential of getting a loan would be greater because you've done something for the lender. So the Gemara wants to tell us that there is a separation between the event and the loan. We don't lump them together and say that looks like ribis. So in effect, what we're saying is that ribis has to be in real time part of the deal, because ribis mukdemes and ribis macheres aren't in real time. It could be a week, a month, whatever it is. Now he makes the loan. I'm observing this whole thing. Do I know that he gave him a gift? Not necessarily, but I see a loan, and the transaction of the loan is 100 for 100. Someone will say, wait a minute, you know how he got that 100? Because he gave the lender a gift a month ago. Says the halacha, that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. So that's the example the Gemara gives of that kind of a case. And again, al pi halacha, we now see that ribis has to be part and parcel of the event, not a separate matter in the event. So we'll stop here. We'll learn some Rashi because the next Gemara goes on. But now we have an understanding of Rav Safra's halacha, and we've also rebutted a couple of the questions on Rav Safra by saying that they are not one and the same. That you can't look at a pikadon and a mashkin as a loan. Therefore, they're acceptable. Okay. So Rashi on Samach Beis and Aleph, Motzia min Alov Elamalda im ein lo mashkin al yedei t'nai shebeneim kigam ribis ketutza. So Rashi is already explaining that, in other words, what we understand in the Gemara, that we take it from the loga to the min Alov Elamalda because there is no specific ribis. B'dinenu im gova machziralo, but Rabbi Lezer, because that's ribis ketutza. L'kamei parachle mavak ribis devreim matinu b'dinenu ein machzir. So we didn't use the term this week, but we used the term avak ribis. What is avak ribis? Avak ribis is kind of like the offshoot or the dust of ribis. So anything that isn't min ha-Torah is avak ribis. So in other words, ribis that appears in a matter, in a transaction, and we said this at the very beginning, that ribis that appears in a transaction that was not agreed to at the outset. For instance, I lent you something and it increased in value. Now, what I'm returning is now worth more. That's ribis. Yeah, but it's not specific ribis the way we understand ribis min Torah. So what he's saying is that midrabanan, yes, you're over on a lot of ribis, but we're going to forego repayment because we're trying to admonish you from being careful not to make a transaction that will look like ribis, but bottom line, when it happens, we don't require repayment. That's the halacha midrabanan. In other words, the Rabbanan can't impose something that the Torah does not require. So when the Rabbanan say, don't do this because let's say it's siyag, it's let's not get to the Issa D'Oraisa, so we're going to make an Issa D'Rabbanan on something of a lesser prohibition. But yet midrabanan, so the rabbis have a right to do that. But when it comes to the halacha, when it comes to were you over a lav, you can only be over a lav if the Torah says you're over a lav. So ribis ketzutza is over a lav because that's the Torah ribis. But avak ribis isn't a lav. It's a mechanism for the rabbanan to prevent you being over a lav. So in other words, to remind you, don't do this because it's ribis ketzutza. So we're going to say, yeah, but there's another kind of ribis we're going to forbid you from doing, so you shouldn't get to ribis ketzutza. That's the theory behind what the Rabbanan do, and you can see this from all the other halachas midrabanan that we shouldn't do them, but you're not over a lav if you do them. Okay, should be dineim ein motzien in the first comment. B'dineinu ein machzirin es ha'odev b'yoker shehikira chatoim hachitim. So the case of saw b'saw, he says, is avak ribis. It's avak ribis because nevertheless the saw increased in price, and we know from our Mishnah that when something increases in price, and that's what the Gemara is going to talk about next week. So when something increases in price, then again that's avak ribis. So you shouldn't do it, but if you do it, there's no tashlumin. Inhibitoris b'kodin oscillati. So the Gemara first says that it's a b'kodin inuki magve saw b'saw. The case of saw b'saw min alov l'malva lav b'toris ribis. Komagabale. He's not returning to him as ribis. Elabatoris b'kodin ube'aneim. The whole saw moiselo b'yodo. Because if I were observing the case, I would say nothing wrong with this. You lent me a bushel. I'm repaying you a bushel. Oh, the bushel is now worth more. Okay, midrabanan, that's avak ribis. But as a practical matter, I'm not going to be deluded into thinking that there's ribis here and I shouldn't do it because I repaid the same saw that you gave me. Says the Gemara, right, but it's not even ribis to begin with because a picodin is different than a loan, and we're considering this to be a picodin. Now, the whole discussion we had this morning, and it's a good discussion, is nuanced on how the Gemara looks at different cases. Now, you might argue, wait a minute, that seems like sleight of hand. It seems like they're trying to do something to avoid an issur. And as a practical matter, that may be the case, that if you call it a picodin and not a loan, you're avoiding the issur. But you have to understand that in the time of the Gemara, when they established the rules, after all, there had to be economic rules of life. You can't just make it happen. So in establishing the economic rules, the Rabbanan of the time said a loan is a loan, and everybody knows what a loan is. But if something's going to be a little different than a loan, we're not going to call it a loan. A saw b'saw is not a loan. So they have a right to say that. So anybody knows that if I'm going to trade in commodities, I'm not making a loan. I'm making a picodin, and there's no interest. Now, and same with the mashkim. They want to make sure everybody knows that when in the circumstances, anything similar to our case, where you have a piece of land and the land can produce whatever, that's not a loan. So therefore, the union of ribis doesn't apply. Now it's avak ribis, because after all, he's eating the grapes. But avak ribis midrabanan, ein machzirin mimalva l'lover. The malva does not have to repay it to the lover because it is midrabanan. Inu b'teres b'kodem asaliyade, right? He said, "B'chiyoma Rav Safra l'milza hocham kolshin b'dineim motziim b'teres ribis b'dineinu machzirin." So the Rashi says he makes it very specific that in the case of ribis, we require a repayment. So again, he's saying that a pekadon is not ribis. Mashkanta below nechaisa, malve mos ala keren, the malve, the ochlas haperis, he lends on the moses ala keren, the ochlas haperis, the in a posek lenochas lo min hachov klum, and he does not pledge. And he doesn't say, in other words, to your questions, if the shtar said, I'm taking this as a mashkin and I'm entitled to eat the produce. But if I eat again, you can articulate this. If I eat the produce, I'll repay you for the produce. Okay? So if he says that in so many words, then there's no problem because he's repaying him al pi the shtar. But the question is, if there is no distinction made in the shtar, and he's lending him $100, then how do we look at the at what the malva is doing? So he's saying there was no discussion, and it looks like he ate b'teres ribis. So that's why the Gemara says that a mashkanta is not ribis. The b'divrei motziim im ochel halova haperes mimashkanta, because it's a vak ribis, and a vak ribis is the issa d'Rabbanan, but not an issa d'Oraisa. Now the ubedinenu ein machziren, the avak ribis here on Amud Bet, we're saying ubedinenu the avak ribis kivan the zimnon shehein osim peros shebekromim lokin ein zu ribis katzutza. So in other words, again, it's not ribis katzutza. Ribis katzutza is only one specific idea according to the Gemara, according to the Torah, that you specifically give someone, in the case of a loan, you give him a loan and he repays you more than the loan. That's what the Torah says is awesome. Everything else is midrabanan. So inu nami afikle sabru, the Gemara says the b'Torah Zavini also he made it as a sale. Hanach peris liade, it came to his hand as a sale. The lokeach, the kolzman shelo paralo, as long as he does not pay him, meaning buying it back. If paralo ma'osav hakeren mocherlo, in other words, the keren was sold to the malveh. And as long as he doesn't repay him, adzman sheposku b'neihem, until they agree sheyachol iftosa that he can redeem it. He's chayef avak ribis the hamar b'peres masnis, because what is avak ribis? That he got more than he bargained for, and that clearly is avak ribis. Shinu nami islay. So in other words, again, you have to understand that in the time of the Gemara, there were all kinds of economic agreements, and in order to make commerce, and again, we saw this many times in the Gemara in the past, that they don't make halachas to chill economic transaction. We don't want to make it so that people won't lend or won't do deals with each other. Therefore, they had to sort of very carefully create a economic sort of mechanism by which people can do business, and at the same time not be violative of halacha. So he says at the end of the day, ribis mukdemes, the ribis ma'acheres. B'shulam masnisin katani le v'hal b'tayros ribis yav le b'dinein im lo nosen and Mutzian Shahari Lo Pasuk Imo. In other words, again, what he's saying is not B'Torah's Ribis, Ubedinehem Im Lo Nosan Ein Mutzian Shahari Lo Pasuk Imo. So again, it's the separation of the events that makes the difference. If they're all part of one event, then it does appear to be a ribis kitsutza because he's getting an economic benefit from the loan. And that's what ribis kitsutza is. But if it's an inducement and has nothing directly to do with the actual transaction, there the Gemara says that although it's a vak ribis, because there is a benefit being transacted, but it's not Torah ribis because it's not part and parcel of the deal. So I think that's really what this is all about. And so we have to understand, and again, to your kashas, Michael and Jay and all, the question here is, how do we value ribis? What does ribis mean? We want to minimize the effect of ribis. So we say that there are many cases that appear as ribis, but they're not ribis. So we're going to limit ribis only to one specific event, and we're going to say all the others are only rabbinic in nature, and therefore midrabanan, okay, you shouldn't do it, but if you do it, then we're not going to force you to repay it. And this is consistent with the way halacha works, is that the idea is not to chill commerce, but to be very specific in what you can and can't do. And therefore, we allow certain things. Again, the Rabbanan put a violation, but we're not going to say that violation really ultimately hampers the ability of people to do business. So anyway, it's a very interesting discussion. And now the Gemara is going to go back to the Mishnah next time, and we're going to delve further into this. But to this whole question of Rav Safra, I thought it was unique because here we have Tana who is equating halacha and looking at halacha through the prism of non-Jewish courts, which that shouldn't come into play. But what he's saying is that you can take your cue from the non-Jewish courts as to what the halacha should be for us. It doesn't mean that we follow the Jewish courts, but it becomes very clear that when they make a pronouncement, and that pronouncement clearly is, in this case, violates halacha, then halacha says the exact opposite. But there are circumstances where they say something and it's not violative of halacha, right? Because it's only midrabanan, and avak ribis is not punishable. So, all right. So then that